Phil Ireland, who is with adoptanegotiator.org. This is a program which has a group of bloggers here in the climate talks, and they've been tracking this process for a couple of years now, and just following their country's negotiator and making sure that they're holding them accountable. Phil, you've been tracking the Australian negotiator, and as part of that you've been in a lot of the open discussions and open meetings, so I guess a good place to start might be to get your impression of how the talks are going here.
I suppose progress has been mixed. There have been some progress on a few issues which are really important, like adaptation and technology transfer. But we've also seen some loggerheads emerging around issues like verification of emission reductions and also financing for poor countries, and also the legal framework or the rules which will shape a future agreement.
And so you've mentioned a couple of issues there, and are there certain countries that are kind of holding things up, or are there other countries that are pushing things forward? What's the I guess it's often a case of people playing the blame game, and it's not necessarily helpful. But what's your impression been so far?
Well, it's sometimes hard to tell who's actually blocking progress because so many of the meetings are closed. But it's clear that a few different countries are blocking things. As usual, we've got the umbrella group with America and China who aren't doing anything overtly blocking, but they haven't legislated emission reduction targets and they're doing things which don't help the negotiations. But on the other end of things, we are in China, and some of us thought that we might move a bit further and China might have a bit more give on some of the key issues. Yet we've found that China's kind of been hesitant to move forward on quite a number of different issues.
Okay, so what do we expect out of this week then, and what do we expect that to lead to in the next major kind of UN climate summit in Cancun in Mexico at the end of this year?
I think we hope to see steps forward in all the negotiating streams. So we're not going to have a whole agreement at the end of this week, but hopefully we'll establish the framework or the context in which we can go boldly into Cancun and actually get the agreement or the framework for the agreement that we're actually wanting.
Okay, so let's focus a little bit on the country that you've been, the country that you're from, and the country that you've been tracking here, which is Australia. What's their position in the talks? Because I guess most of our viewers won't be familiar with it. What's Australia's attitude towards climate change in the international arena?
So their public attitude, and once again, so many of the meetings are closed, so it's hard to know what is actually said behind closed deals. But Australia does want a legally binding international treaty on climate change. What their emission reduction target is under that is still up for question because we don't have domestic legislation. The government's tried to get legislation through our Senate and our lower house, but they did fail last year, and it's actually quite embarrassing coming back to these negotiations over and over again without legislation to reduce our carbon pollution. But they do want a legally binding agreement, and I know a lot of the negotiating team here do work really hard in the talks to work towards that. They don't always put forward positions that I'd agree with, but they certainly do work hard. And in China, I've seen that they are working towards an agreement. Around the issue of a legal framework, they're wanting to talk first about what the legal framework is before they actually commit to any mitigation targets. Whereas China wants the converse. They want to know the mitigation targets before we talk about legal frameworks. Perhaps all sides could give a little more, and I think Australia's certainly in that basket.
Okay, you mentioned the domestic politics there and this problem about getting the legislation through. What's going on? For those of us on the outside, we see the odd story in the newspaper, and it seems like it's kind of caused quite a lot of controversy. But is there like a big denial movement in Australia? Is it the economy that's the kind of problem? I know there's coal is a big issue. What's holding you back?
Oh, there's a whole swathe of questions there, isn't there? So we've just had an election, and the previous government within the Senate didn't have a majority in the Senate. So you need to have a majority to just get legislation through. The emissions trading scheme they put up to put a limit on our carbon pollution wasn't passed because both the Greens rejected it because they didn't think it was ambitious enough, and the opposition rejected it because they thought it was too ambitious. Our opposition is actually now led by someone who has expressed climate skepticism in the past. He famously said climate change is absolute crap. So that creates a kind of messy
Very Australian way of putting things.
It is. But that's created a kind of difficult negotiating context. But the hopeful thing is that within our new parliament, we now have a different balance of power. Within the Senate, The Greens have balance of power, so if they agree with the legislation, it will get through. And in our lower house, we actually have our first Green elected to the lower house in an election which was largely in response to the failure of the government to get an agreement on climate change. So there are hopeful signs. And our government has taken a number of progressive steps in the past months, both Prime Minister Gillard and Climate Change Minister Greg Combet, to slightly speed up the rate at which they're moving towards a price on carbon pollution. And hopefully before South Africa next year, we will have that.
Okay, and you think that's a realistic goal, do you? You think that's something Australia can achieve?
I do. So before the election, the government's policy was we're going to delay it for another 3 years and then see what the playing field's like. But after the election and the fact that there are Greens now in both houses, Prime Minister Gillard's been able to say, well, it's a different context, it's a new context, we have to be a little more flexible. So they've started up a high-level committee to consider all options, and hopefully out of this will come legislation into both houses that will see a legislated price on carbon before South Africa next year. So I'm hopeful, and Australians are hopeful, and we'll see how it goes. We'll keep pushing domestically, that's for sure.
Okay. Well, I'm sure, as our viewers can tell, Phil's got some pretty good insights into the workings of the Australian negotiating team here, and also Australian politics and climate change back in the UK. For those of our viewers who'd like to track what you're talking about and follow these discussions, how can they do that?
You can check out our website at www.adoptanegotiator.org, where we've got a range of different trackers from countries from Europe, America, Australia, all blogging about their negotiating team. My blogs are obviously under the category Australia. Check it out and leave comments so we can take them to our negotiators.
Okay, brilliant. I think that's a nice note to leave it on, so I'll hand back to our studio in the UK.
Thanks.